On the day that they announced lockdown, my mum went into care. This started about a year earlier. My mum had been relatively ill for a number of years for a number of reasons. She was in her 80s and she started to generally lose mobility, and we had a couple of incidents that we had to call ambulances, and my dad, also in his 80s, was unable to cope. My sister was coming down from London back and forward and staying with him for a few days, and I was going over and helping wherever I could, work permitting. And it became quite obvious at one point that there was a point in time when I was in the house and my dad had got my mum, who was by this time more or less bedridden, a doorbell to press and if she needed help. And we had already set up things like Alexa for her so she could change the channel on TV and phone people and do things like that, put the lights on and off through Alexa. But if there was anything she actually needed help with, she rang the doorbell. And there was a day that I was there and my dad had just got a cup of tea and he just sat down in his chair as the doorbell went that my mum had, and he visibly paled in colour. And I thought at that point, oh, this is not good. This is not doing my dad any good. And what we decided at that point is that we really need to give Dad some time. Obviously it wasn't straightforward, but we organised some respite care for my mum. And we got that organised for 6 weeks of respite care. And it turned out that the very day that she went into care was the day that they announced a COVID lockdown. So we couldn't visit my mum, was the initial issue. We could Skype her, and which, being in her 80s, was quite hilarious because we got Skyping the top of her head and she wasn't sure how to do it. But it was good because we could actually talk to her, and we phoned her, and my sister actually at one point managed to get a chat with her through a window on one occasion. And she was out at the home at Dalmellington was good, but she wasn't particularly happy there. About 4 weeks into it, it became apparent that she wasn't going to be allowed to be discharged from the care back into my dad's care because of the situation with COVID. And that she didn't take that very well, but she put up with it again. You know, fairly stoic. She put up with it. We phoned her regularly. We talked to her on Skype regularly. And then one day I got a phone call when I was at a studio friend of mine, and she had died. And that was quite hard because we hadn't actually been able to visit her for a number of months. My dad found it relatively difficult as well, but I mean, as a man in his late 80s, he was also just taught to get on with things and just carry on with his life. And my dad was a keen cyclist, and he went out almost every day, weather permitting. He would be out as long as the wind wasn't too bad. He would be out and he would do 20 or 30 miles on his bike round about Stewarton and that kind of area. He'd go round the wee roads and do that, and he would go up. When my mum died, my dad, once he was able, once the COVID restrictions were lifted enough for him to sort of be able to go out a bit further, he would go out, you know, he would go out to sort of Comores and Irvine and places like that, and he would go and cycle round about, and it was kind of living for it. It was all he really talked about, and it was all he really did. My dad met my mum when he was 9 years old, and they had both, you know, got married relatively young, and they had just stayed together, and they had a really good relationship for two people that had been together that long. But it was allowing him to have something to do. He could go every day more or less cycle his bike and enjoy himself, and he would tell us, I'd be over fairly regularly, and he'd tell me where he'd been and what was changing round about the neighbourhood, and thoroughly enjoying it. And then one day in the summer of 2021, I get a phone call from my sister saying that my dad had been knocked over on his bike when he was on his bike, and that she was actually at the scene. I was hanging the washing out at this point with her trying to talk into the phone at the same point. And she was saying that he had a broken leg and a broken arm, quite obviously, and that they weren't sure what had happened, and they had brought a helicopter in with some medics on it. But it looked as if he was okay. He was talking, and he was sort of being, again, pretty stoic about it. And so obviously got the kids looked after, and he was getting taken to Queen Elizabeth Hospital, which I made my way up to Queen Elizabeth Hospital. By the time I got there, he had been taken into surgery, and I met my sister in the relatives room, and she recounted what had happened to him. And once she had arrived at the hospital, his bed had been surrounded by doctors and nurses and a film crew, bizarrely, who he had already signed consents for them to film him. So he got taken into surgery, and we get informed about 2 o'clock in the morning that he had some relatively serious injuries. He had his pelvis was damaged quite badly. He had some internal injuries, broken arm, broken leg, and they were going to have to do a fair bit of surgery on him. So they did that. They stabilised him. They got the internal bleeding stopped. They sort of stabilised the pelvis. And then the next day they were going to have a further look at him. So we came back in the next day, and he was still under in a sort of medically induced coma at that point. And they told us that unfortunately there was issues with his leg, his broken leg, and it wasn't getting any blood, and they would have to take one of his legs off. So we were obviously a bit dismayed at this point, because it would have meant that he couldn't get on his bike again when he recovered. And but there's nothing else you can really do. His leg comes off or he dies effectively. And he got very, very good treatment. They took his leg off, and then the following day we went in. He was still in the medically induced coma, and they said, right, well, this is it. This is a make or break kind of 48 hours when the body starts to sort of heal and decide, like exactly how things are going to be. We were sort of phoning the hospital every hour or so just to see how he was, and they had encouraged us to do that and make sure that we stayed in touch, and we were allowed to visit whenever we want. So we were up a couple of times that day. And then about 9 o'clock that evening, we got the phone call to say that there was a number of complications that had started to appear, and it looked like they weren't going to be able to save him. And that was pretty hard. We visited him. He was still unconscious, but we had a sort of what we would hope would have been a sort of normal visit that you'd have in hospital. We talked about what was going on in each of our families, and we just sort of chatted as if he was replying to us and talking about what was happening in Stuart and what about his bike and stuff like that. And then we let the staff know that they could effectively let him go, and that's exactly what happened. Within about an hour or so he was gone. he lived a full life. He had loads of stories he could tell. He enjoyed his life, and he lived to 89, and I think that's a fair innings. He didn't suffer particularly much. Obviously, he got knocked down and went through that trauma, but it was sad, but I think there's a lot worse ways to go. It gave me a sort of more positive outlook in life, and like a decision to properly do things that I want to do, to, you know, the things that I enjoy doing, and work and try and make work be what you want it to be rather than be what other people want it to be, and to try and make sure that you're doing the right things. You're not getting pushed into doing stuff you don't want to do. You're not neglecting your family because you're working too much, and you just kind of get more of a balance, which is something that I've never really had in my life. Work has been fairly, it's taken over my life since I was probably 15. It's been the sort of main thing that's happened. All the rest of the things in life they've been neglected probably because I'm kind of too obsessive about work. So that's kind of changed that, and it has created a much more positive outcome for me now, which I'm getting the benefit of. And I think certainly my experience is that my life is now a better place.